So welcome everyone to tonight's lecture from Viola Ago. We've been lucky to have Viola around all year as, along with Gallo Canizares, one of our Christos Yessios visiting professors. Viola and Gallo have been directing a non-stop schedule of workshops, talks, soon an exhibition, not so soon a conference, and tonight a lecture, all under the banner of Interferences, a project that seeks to reframe and disrupt contemporary discourses in digital design. Now, you probably know all of this already because you've been perhaps part of one of the studios that Viola has taught here, which in reductively simple terms has attempted to set up a series of conflations between volumes and graphics. Or you already know this because you participated in one of the workshops Viola has organized examining augmented reality and experimental image transferring techniques. Or you already know this because you've seen any number of the recent large-scale installations developed by Viola along with Hans Tersak at the A&D Museum in Los Angeles, at Art OMI in New York, and very soon in Columbus, Indiana for the 2019 iteration of Exhibit Columbus. So if I can just assume that you already know Viola, or at least you know her work, or at least you're about to, instead I would just provide a very brief comment about one particular aspect of her work that's both extremely interesting and I think indispensable for the school at large. So I hope Viola doesn't think this is kind of a naive reading, I guess. But one way to describe what Viola does is as an attempt to orchestrate something that I would call a non-total design process. By non-total, I mean to say that Viola's work involves the invention of design processes that seem to deliberately fail to circumscribe the entirety of a project's narrative. You can see this in surface-based image experiments like etching or screen printing that wrap supported volumes whose formal logics are derived elsewhere. You can see this in experimental material fabrication processes like robotic hydrodipping, in which the precision of CNC scripted movements inevitably fails to account for unpredictable fluid dynamics. Or you can see this in a general methodology of working in which the blind spots of standard design software, such as a proclivity for meshes or nerves, are played off of one another such that any project, any particular software owns only a non-total role in the definition of a given project. Now, a non-total design project might not exactly sound like a good thing, and almost certainly has been the justification for a lot of bad studio grades. But I'd like to suggest, Jeff never has a total project, but I'd like to suggest that in Viola's work, the non-total project becomes a radical proposition for computational architecture itself. We should remember one of the underlying characteristics of any computer is that it requires a reality to operate in that is, on a certain fundamental level, computable. And the more computable a given reality is, the more useful its computers become. Now, this principle suggests that perhaps the enduring narrative of computational architecture shouldn't so much be the story of people trying to figure out how to make architecture with computers, but rather the slow process of rendering architecture computable in the first place. This is a story that provides us with contemporary building information management platforms like Revit, where seemingly disparate concerns such as global commodity supply chains, wall sections, and the performance of the sun are all rendered mutually computable. It's a story that lurks somewhere beneath any of the recent innovations in digital fabrication that promise an ever more predictable fidelity in the translation from information to matter. And it's an explicit narrative of parametricism's total and totalitarian ambition for a computable thread stretched between the smallest architectural detail on one hand and planet Earth on the other. So with the discipline's long dream of a totally computable architecture, and in fact a totally computable reality as its historical backdrop, Viola's playing out of non-total digital processes serves as a kind of short-circuiting of the underlying politics of the computer itself. In images that fail to resolve their supporting structures, in software platforms that fail to speak each other's languages, or robots that fall short of anticipating the intricate ways in which a floating graphic drifts across a pool of water, Viola's work turns the limits of computation, or the edges of the computable processes, into scenarios that undermine our perceptual faculties. And in encountering these difficulties of perception, we're perhaps shown a version of the world that's made a bit more difficult to compute, populated with versions of ourselves as slightly less total computers. So let's welcome Viola.
Okay, that was actually the entire lecture. I'm just going to follow it up with some images. Thank you, Curtis. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and again, thank you, Curtis, for the very generous introduction. Further thanks to Chris Yessios for making this project possible, and even more thanks, of course, to the school and my colleagues for the support and friendship over the last few months that I've been here. Just to quickly update you on our 2-year project, so far Gallo and I have successfully run 4 workshops with the participation of Knowlton's fantastic student body and our invited workshop leaders. I'm delivering the first first lecture in our series. Gala will be delivering a similar talk next semester. We're also planning exhibitions of our respective research projects in the Vanguard Gallery next year and a companion symposium. That's all in the planning stages at the moment, so don't write that down, but many more exciting things to come in the near future. Okay, so my talk today, titled Assemblies on Volumes and Graphics, I want to demonstrate that through a hyper-focused research project, one can derive a thesis about architectural culture at large. The Assemblies heading refers to a kind of current mood of collective thinking and contemporary design that has to do with the collapse of representational issues and digital fabrication. The volumetric and graphic interests are kind of the excuse to focus these more abstract concerns on a series of design exercises. It should go without saying that as a designer, I begin with visual issues and the premise that geometry is an expressive language capable of articulating more theoretical concerns. I wanted to put a few disciplinary questions on the table with this talk, and I also wanted to show design work and research, so you can probably think of this as somewhere between a lecture and a discussion of recent work. I will start off with a hyper-short biographical narrative, talking about the path that I took to get here. Then I want to go through a theoretical argument that will serve as a conceptual framework for the images with images from an earlier project. That setup looks at the contemporary status of digital tools in architecture and suggests a few key questions for aesthetic discourse and digital design. I will then fast forward to now and look at two recent projects, one built and one in the prototyping phase. I want to talk about those projects through the lens of some light design theory, surveying the contemporary conceptual landscape of architects using digital tools and fabrication processes to explore geometric organizations. And lastly, I will end with a series of projects that are more in the realm of pure research, spanning workshops, experiments in the studio, and my personal work that I've been doing here at Knowlton with my research team. So, a short biographical introduction. While I was studying in Los Angeles, I was deeply enmeshed in the design culture of the city. Shortly after school, I worked at Morphosis for a few formative years. These are three projects that contributed to the most during my time there. I was quite lucky, as two of these projects are actually built, which can be sometimes rare when you work in an experimental, design-focused firm like Morphosis. I was also very fortunate to be on the computation and advanced technology team. There were 4 of us there at the time, 4 women actually, who primarily worked on the design of facades and atrium spaces for all of the projects that will go through the office. In the very limited time that I had outside of the office, I was often working in these multi-layered information drawings. This was an interest that was sparked in me while I was still in school. At the time, I was really interested in vectors and vector-based information and how that could communicate painterly effects. When I was making these drawings, however, I was, strangely enough, influenced by building information packages. And I started to integrate annotations, which are typically only used for CD sets, prototyping, fabrication, and other construction-related phases. In these works, I was interested in the aestheticization of that information as a visual exercise. So working in LA, I was clearly caught between two worlds, as many of us are when we deeply care about architecture, but need to establish ourselves as emerging practitioners. I was in this very immense environment of computation and advanced digital tools, and I was deeply invested in how they relate to practice. But I was also still very much engaged with experimental visual work, so I had an urge to question this type of paradox. Okay, so here's part of the setup for the talk. And one question that I would like to offer as something to struggle with. The emergence of visual programming and object-oriented programming paradigms, open source computing, other accessible platforms proliferated our discipline at pretty high rates. So here's a simple Google image search of projects with 3 keywords: digital, design, and architecture. So starting off as a scientific exploration, the emergence of code-based design and digital design in architecture did not really work in parallel with other critical frames of reference. So in other words, it did not engage with a discipline in meaningful aesthetic, spatial, or visually focused registers, and yet developed a particular style brand that is currently very recognizable as such. That kind of isolated and even hermetic mode of thinking can be intuited in image spreads like this one here. But this paradox isn't as new as it may seem. Code-based design actually has precedence in visual art and art theory. In his now famous article, Systems Aesthetics, art theory's Jack Burnham addressed the influence of technological interferences with the advanced art of his moment. He attempted to illustrate the cultural transition structured by the influx of technology by looking at minimal and conceptual art. In this paradigm shift, he argued that the technological transition could be thought of as moving from object-oriented to systems-oriented ways of thinking and seeing. In other words, he sensed a shift in interest from things themselves to the way that things are made. It should be clear that this is not like art that glorifies technology per se. Burnham argued that the modern aesthetic impulse needs to actively participate and relate to technological means of research and production. Fair enough, but architects might be too comfortable with this way of thinking at this present moment. So one could argue that in our present condition, in the landscape of computation, broadly speaking, privileges the pseudoscientific project and oftentimes lacks integration with platforms related to other visual cultures. So there's a growing, very problematic cultural rift in this play. I think we went through a serious phase of widespread anxiety and frenzy after the first digital turn in architecture. Maybe we haven't recovered yet. So there's been a lot of speculation and confusion, in my opinion, as architects try to renegotiate a healthier relationship with digital tools and software. I mean, we're still going through the transition. However, I think we're at least past the adolescent years of that relationship and can now re-engage in that conversation in more productive ways. In my own critical reconciliation with the digital during my time in practice and currently, I started to look at Mel Bachner's serial attitude for alternatives. The critique I presented so far, spanning sort of over the last 10 years or so in design, is one where new styles have been developing haphazardly, even accidentally. There seems to be a kind of style war in both camps, actually. The history theory-driven designers and the algorithmic ones, or the digital processes ones. But it's refreshing to read Burnham and Mel Bachner talk about the 70s in similar terms. In his essay, Bachner argued that the serial order is a method and not a style. I found this to be encouraging, to read about a time when the discipline of art was looking to withdraw from associations of style or maybe redefine it. Maybe systems can be styles and styles can be systems. So seriality, as defined by Bachner, is a recurring theme in my work. As a broad term, it generally defines as a number of similar or related things that are structured in some sort of sequence. For Bachner, seriality is concerned with the order of things and not with their execution. So he goes a step further from Burnham's earlier propositions. He further illustrated the significance of this mode of thinking by separating it into two types: artists that simply work in series, and artists that embed a series-based methodology within one work. I advocate working with the latter one, for example. So here's what that looks like, and I hope you find this as provocative and relevant as I do. This is a group of William de Kooning's women paintings. 7 of them among many, many more. I think it's in the hundreds. According to Bachner, de Kooning's investigation exemplifies work that is based on a theme with different variations. De Kooning painted the same subject with slight deviations each time, therefore creating a body of work related to, in this case, abstract expressionism. So we're in the realm of style here. Jasper Johns, on the other hand, the image on the right, operated with simple logical propositions. His colored alphabet, as shown here, used conventions that have a beginning and an end, a closed system, a known closed system, presumably everybody knows the alphabet, thereby establishing the work as serial within the artwork itself, embeddedly serial. So this was an attitude, according to Bachner, a kind of methodology which is in opposition to style. Fast forward to the early 2010s, CNI, a theorist who writes extensively on aesthetics and culture, wrote a book on what she considers to be 3 primary dominant aesthetic categories. The most compelling one for me was her proposal for an aesthetic of difference, reappropriated from the 60s and 70s conceptual art movement, which Mel Bachner was a pioneer of. So she describes this aesthetic project of difference as something that emerges out of variation, information, and even forensic evidence. In this diagram, she sketches out a parallel between literary theory and conceptual art. Her aesthetic of difference arose out of art criticism that looked at work which no longer was about virtuosity. Work that was instead about lists of data on objects, things, actions, and performances. work that represents a break from classical art, expressive art, and the cult of the genius, the singular genius. So again, we're talking about things like conceptual and process art here. And here's how that works. Take, for example, Eleanor Untine's Blood of the Poet box on the left. The box contains blood samples from 100 poets and an associated specimen list. Untine's work had a personalized narrative approach that resulted in collections of data. Ed Richet's work is another example that speaks to the same format. Stains, the image on the right, contains 76 stains from mixed media such as water, beer, blood, juice, and more. Both of these artists' work exists as a type of collection, a set, an assemblage, thematically unified into a series by the concept of evidence or forensic-like information. Another famous, or even infamous, example is a show curated by Mel Bachner, which included 4 identical binders that exhibited receipts, phone calls, purchase orders, rough sketches, notes, and other related documentation for artwork. Artists supplied this information, but not the actual final works themselves. So, lists of data are very well known to the computer programmer. In fact, it's the basis of any code to declare your variables. At a certain level of abstraction, conceptual art is actually not far off from writing code or scripting logics to generate some work. On a conceptual level, the systems approach of the work is therefore one that performs with the varying characteristics of units and the repetition of these units to create a set. This automatically renders the work mathematical and spatial. So my argument through readings of Nye, Bachner, and Burnham is that serial modes might provide a certain kind of computation-friendly design discourse with a model for aesthetic evaluation, a conceptual bridge almost in the transition phase that we currently occupy. So more specifically, or another example that Nye provides, argues that relationships of units in system can provide a form of aesthetic judgment that for a work to be successful, it only needs to be interesting. So this is Ed Richet's various small fires in milk. In this piece, Richet showcases a series of fires on one image of a glass of milk. The milk is the one unit that destabilizes the series, such that it can offer a window into another version of the set, or a background by which to evaluate the relationships between all the other images in the collection. This is a series-based work that is hardly expressive in any conventional definition, but one that is undeniably interesting. So I wonder if certain strands of contemporary architecture might take cues from Nye's reading of conceptual art and move away from the cult of novelty. With that framework in mind, I want to talk about an earlier project of mine that operates in series and employs line drawings as clusters or units of visual content. This series, comprised of 8 or maybe 9 objects, depending on how you look at it, was part of my Muschenheim Fellowship exhibition at the University of Michigan's Taubman College of Architecture. The 9th object, on the top right-hand corner, is inserted into the series as a deviation, or rather a distraction, as something that, not unlike Richet's glass of milk, can recontextualize the set. In the physical manifestation of the deviation, seen in the image on the left, the drawing has been actually whited out and become something more experimental and other in nature. So before I talk about the three-dimensional objects in more detail, I want to elaborate on the drawing component. As I mentioned earlier, I've always been interested in line drawings and the distinction between drawings as representation and drawing as information. In this project, I was focused on the representational aspect of the drawing as it plugs into our current modes of visual production. That is, 3D models that produce multiple drawings from a singular object. Though there is very slight undertone of digital information as a visual catalyst, but I'll talk about that more in a minute. So the use of the line carries with it a level of simplicity that is very important to my work. I mean, what could be more elemental in a way? Somewhere between line drawings and painted surfaces, these objects offer the visual effect of motion, tracing movements from the picture support to the picture plane. The trace is spatialized line drawing. The topmost layer of these objects, the white linear one, does the most work to create the illusion of depth while maintaining a three-dimensional sculptural effect. Although static in nature, the appearance of motion is mobilized by the directionality and continuity of the clusters of parallel lines, almost as if there are arrows that slowly guide your eyes through these movements. The planar-like clusters are not describing frames in motion, but rather traces of motion, as they flow from one direction to the next. Although the clusters of lines bend and change direction frequently and at times overlay, they always maintain a sense of continuity. There are no endpoints in these compositions. The lines terminate at the boundary of the drawing or the boundary of the support. And by support here, I refer to Michael Fried's definition of painting support as in the host of the painting content. The relationship is best illustrated maybe by Fried's reading of Frank Stella's Shape Canvas works. So the lines never break. They imply a stream-like transition from one implied plane, in this example horizontal, to the next. These virtual planes are not in physical motion, but they suggest some type of event. The continuous line transition from one face to the next, as it draws a composition that again reinforces the idea of tracing on a flat picture plane. So this is another way that I was attempting to spatialize or architecturalize the line drawing. The diagram on the left, as described by Rudolf Arnheim, demonstrates the ability and the desire of the eye to read movement as an extension of lines, here denoted by the dotted arrows, and not the actual movement, which is denoted by the solid arrows. And Anthony McCall's work, on the right, plays with visual perception fields in similar ways. These diagrams challenge the premise of the figurative, continuous line by juxtaposing two different ellipsoid forms with one another, but always maintaining an implied aperture between the two. So, back to the ninth object, the deviation from the series. I similarly tried to negotiate a less expected play between line, depth, and space. In this example, the picture plane is slightly displaced, decoupled from its host, and disoriented. It's firstly placed on the floor, and while it still maintains its verticality, it's slightly rotated and separated from its support to create another zone of spatial play. This combination of white lines and white translucent lines produces an architectural specific drawing that invites the viewer to observe it from different points in the gallery, revealing itself over time. The drawing has, I hope, been transformed beyond the pedestaled object or the pinned-up board to an expanded field of spatial illusion, as it's both virtual and it participates within our space. The lines in this series are not only charged with producing effect tectonically, but also with creating compositional qualities on a flatbed picture plane, support, or in other words, frame. There are two things at play here, one competing for emphasis over the other. On the one hand, this example attempts to have the physicality of the support embedded in the structure of the drawing. On the other hand, the drawing itself is framed in such a way that it simultaneously ignores the picture support in hopes that the perception of the image object can be flattened out. Another key factor in the construction of this balancing act is the dialogue between line and color in an attempt to dissipate the physicality of the surface it occupies. There's typically 5 layers of color fills, line traces, and digital information in all these drawings, each one playing an important role in the emergence of figures, negative voids, misalignments, and other graphic effects. So, looking outside the realm of architecture to the discipline of painting, I'm interested in the phenomena of edges. Again, there's this focus on the elemental. So some theorists claim that there are two fundamental categories of paintings. Paintings that are based on line drawings and paintings that are based on the immediate application of color fills. So here I'm specifically focusing on the application of pink, black, and white lines in this series. As architects started to adopt techniques from painting and modernism, they challenged the older painterly binary of edge-bound graphic fields and the direct application of color. So line drawings and renderings changed from black lines that confined a boundary to implied white lines that described areas between fills. And this one, seemingly trivial, an example like the figure to the right can no longer be perceived as having a boundary. The edge condition disappears into the optical field of the artboard or printer paper. In art conventions and mainstream drawing culture, white usually means something like a void, like the void of the white plotter paper. So in other words, there's no output for white lines. It's simply an absence through which the paper shows through as a visual placeholder. In the art world, however, as drawings started gaining stature and autonomy in modernist and post-war art, white lines were not restricted to the same status. To illustrate, Swai Twombly engages the physical and subsequent visual conditions of his drawing by using white chalk on a blackboard. Similarly, sculptor Frank Sandbach draws lines in acrylic twine and uses interior architectural space as his medium. conditions where the line becomes unstable visually, so it confounds figure-ground distinctions. So my curiosities lie somewhere in this interchange between physical and optical consequences of the line as it emerges from our digital processes and workflows. This brief snapshot shows several primary states that the line passes through during the production of this drawing. Through its printing process on rigid material, the lines and color no longer belong to the flattened image. They're now integrated with the properties of the support. So this diagram shows the layer structure of this particular drawing. So, okay, this breakdown shows the structural logics at play in the assembly of linear and chromatic information. The very first printed layer to the far right is a solid white fill that functions as a mask to hide and reveal two different states of material transparency. The rest of the layers are then sequentially built one on top of the other until the final figure emerges, thereby establishing a clear route from the virtual to the material. The aesthetic objective of the scaffold, however, almost forges an intimate relationship between structure and form. The white fill layer to the far left, or in other words, the mask, is the first mark that creates a figure in the field. The second layer, the first layer of white lines, the second image to the left, conflates the figure on ground by gently softening the edges of the explicit outline of the figure from the first layer. So the color fill layer adjusts and varies the transparency and the printed support material. The drawing component of the piece, which is made of two layers, the black lines and the white lines, is then finally printed as separate layers. Without the sequential construct of this color, line, material, support conversation I just outlined, these final linear elements would simply read as inscriptions sitting on top of a different surface. So I wanted to give you the whole magnified analysis of the physical manifestations of these drawings to expose the capacities of the line beyond mere drawing and representation. These works, for me, play with notions of repetition, similarity, variance, and relief. The drawings become especially entangled between material and optical problems as the top layer of lines echo the discrete, frame-bound composition underneath, and the bottom layer of lines as they modestly wrap around the underlying support. The ghostly traces of each drawing's figure sometimes come together to form a whole, and at other moments remain separated in distinct layers. Although there are many optical and technical variables in play here, as I've shown, the final work still operates in response to the collapse of painting and drawing in our contemporary culture of architectural representation. Needless to say, these issues go beyond my modest investigations. The architectural drawing as a type is in a strange place, I believe, as we collectively blur categories and defining boundaries between what is instructional, representational, process-based, documentary, and that which is purely driven by technique. Okay, so as a continuation and sometimes deviation from this research, I'm going to quickly show two projects, both done in collaboration with my sometimes collaborator, Hans Tersag. This project, titled Transfers, is located in a sculpture park called Art OMI in Ghent, New York. It's about 3 hours north of New York City. It's up for 2 years, so next time you're in New York, I recommend you make some time to visit Dia Beacon, Storm King, and OMI. So, the basic premise of the project is that the piece should read like a proto-architectural massing study. In our conversations with the curator, we decided that it should read like an urban tower situated in the woods. There are two primary sources of inspiration for the project. The image on the left shows volumetric, almost stereotomic clusters projected or dragged through a 2.5D environment. The image on the right is from a really extraordinary show of Michael Heiser's work at the Whitney Museum in 1985 called Drag Mass Geometric. In this exhibition, Heiser built massive stereotomic forms out of aluminum scaffolds and corrugated board. The panels are silk-screened with abstracted images that Heiser took of the southwestern landscape. So, contextualizing landscape graphics on the interior of a gallery via geometric organizations. From a formal perspective, the aim of the project was to reconcile a crystalline faceted geometric massing study with line work, 2D drawings. So in the form, you can read the influence of Heiser and Tony Smith, and the graphic was more inspired by Agnes Martin's systemic compositions. And maybe also like elevations of urban towers at night, as we'll see in a minute. So this is another early Heiser installation. Here the forms show evidence of prehistoric architectural configurations that later take shape in his monumental city project. In this example, however, there's this continued use of abstracted photographs of the desert or other landscapes as an analog texture map. Here's a form generation diagram of the piece. Here the idea was to nest two volumes inside of one another. On the second row of the drawing, you can see a kind of carving operation on the outer volume to reveal the inner figure. And on the third row, a sequence of compressive forces that begin to kind of crush the volume in on itself. So we're really interested in the stereotomic expression, but when it comes to actually making the piece, it's made out of thin planes, just like Tony Smith and Michael Heiser's work is often made out of plywood or thick board. So the project was sponsored by Korean solid surface materials, which is what we use. We also created a 1/4-inch thick water jet aluminum structure to support the Korean panels. Following some of the fellowship work that I showed earlier, each panel of the piece is printed using a flatbed commercial sign printer. The piece was designed to be flat packed and shipped in the back of a small van, so there's also like an economic justification for this project, and the kind of makeup of the project it's designed like a kit of parts. So this is the piece under construction. We used a very low tolerance level of 1/32 of an inch in the fabrication and assembly of the piece. The assembly logics take into consideration that we're going to construct the work with very low-tech tools and with just the two of us on site. Here's some connection details where the aluminum water jet structure meets the printed and milled corian. We thought it was important to actually express the hardware and to show the connections between the parts and the different material systems. So it should read like a continuous shell from far away and like an assembly up close. One of the better views, in my opinion, is actually from the back of the piece, as shown here. You can also see how the graphic map sort of misses or skips off the corian massing. I mean, there's another theme of the work, or like in the top as well, how a graphic map talks to its three-dimensional support, or in other words, framed. So the conversation between drawing, material, and material assembly is what hopefully motivates the viewer to study the piece in the round and the 360. Okay, so geometric postures, line networks, tectonics, surface articulations, and so on can be illustrated here in a little bit of a larger scale. This next project is currently in the prototyping and development phase. We presented our final design in January, and the piece will be constructed later this year in August. So the pavilion is for the upcoming Exhibit Columbus exhibition in Columbus, Indiana. Many of you may know about Columbus. It's a mecca for modernist and postmodernist architecture. The town has works by Vituri, Deborah Burr, I.M. Pei, and others. Our piece is going to sit right in front of Ierosarinen's First Christian Church in a landscape designed by Dan Kiley. When we put our initial proposal together over the summertime, we started with two lines of inspiration, sort of like two conceptual drivers. First, we wanted to imagine a series of architectural forms as wireframes or skeletal constructions, so volumes read as lines in space. The second thing we wanted to explore was how architecture might give shape to abstract natural systems. So we were thinking about the ways that we, in popular culture, conventionally exhibit natural history and ecological networks. It was exciting to start to consider a program with this project as we went up in scale. From a formal perspective, we looked at artists that work with skeletal frames. The question for us was, can an architectural structure be expressive? And again, there's also this idea of form as a diagram of forces at play. A question that I like to think about is, how can one compose with physics? Can one subject a form to virtual or simulated gravity as a way of generating schemes? Thinking about the pavilion program over the summertime, we were reading a number of philosophers interested in materialist and ecological theories. Thinkers asking abstract questions about our relationship to inanimate things. Part of the reason we wanted a more visually porous massing is driven by the other major element of the project, its program as a full-scale vivarium or terrarium. The basic material idea for a pavilion is that we are co-opting ready-made assembly logics from greenhouse kits. So a combination of off-the-shelf components and machine precision fabricated parts. The actual enclosure will be clear, structured polycarbonate panels. The panels will be cut to match the primary and secondary structural elements of the frame. So on the interior, we've designed a planar arrangement of planters, information boards, artificial lighting, and fabricated terrain. During the day, we hope the installation will be a site for natural encounter and social gathering. During the evening, the structure will be illuminated from within. Here we were actually kind of inspired by the glass volume on top of Deborah Burke's Irwin Union Bank. If you haven't been to Columbus, you may have seen the film. So you can see a continuation of some of our earlier work in the geometry of the pavilion's massing. This interest in faceted seratomic forms rendered in lightweight structural system and reflective skins. So turning to issues of fabrication, we're designing the pavilion's frame as a kit of interlocking, flat, digitally fabricated components. We've been very fortunate to receive yet another corporate sponsorship from Autodesk for our project. As research residents at their build space in Boston, we're now developing prototypes and tube bending workflows for the structure's frame. The plan is to fabricate the framing elements using a CNC tube bending machine, so each frame will have connection logic built into its geometry. So again, we want to minimize labor-intensive on-site assembly processes, such as like precision welding, for example. So our plan is to fabricate the panels such that the entire pavilion can again be flat packed and transported to our site. In this drawing, you can see us working to optimize the amount of unique radii at each frame's bending moments, for example. So our fabrication thesis is that digital tools can easily accommodate an infinite amount or an infinite variety of unique parameters like radii, length, and so on. But for our interest in research, we're aiming to land somewhere between standardized production and 100% custom fabrication. So we see the pavilion as a model for something that is potentially scalable. Here's a physical model that we built for the design presentation last month. In the model itself, you can see how we're starting to think about the construction relationship between multiple elements, such as planar arrangements, wireframe and linear expressions, formal articulations, and surface conditions. Okay. So I talked about what I would call the tectonics of the line in the first part of the lecture, and some more formal and graphic motivations in the second part. In this final part of the talk, I want to conclude with a project that attempts a convergence of these two drivers. How do lines take on graphic roles, and how do those graphics and volumes start to communicate with one another? This final project, titled Poppy Red, should be looked at as an ongoing work, more research-based driven rather than the production of specific artifacts. I originally started working on this project as I was writing an article on discrete geometries and the reappraisal of the digital for the AD magazine issue 89, which is going to be out in print this April. So building on some of the earlier thoughts on seriality, specifically CNI, in this article I expanded on the modernist notion of part-to-whole logics. So in this investigation, I also turned to Bruno Latour's composition theory, which is concerned with the immanent conditions of what is already in the world. So the theory composes existing things in non-hierarchical and non-totalizing organizations, as opposed to the sort of like modernist transcendental model. To illustrate in that article, Latour uses Thomas Saraceno's work. So this work is called, has a very long title, it's called Galaxies Forming Along Filaments like Droplets Along the Strands of a Spider Web. He uses this work as a visual metaphor that resists hierarchical order and center points, and instead creates highly intricate conditions of nesting. So the work celebrates interdependence of different elements into flat ontological schemes. This composition-based method of working and evaluating, even, is what makes Saraceno's like Galaxy Works a contemporary theoretical diagram and visually enticing sculptural work. Another illustration of this network theory that focuses on parts rather than wholes can be read in Gilles Retson's ongoing research on discrete geometries. In this composition, Retson aligns thickened linear elements with some underlying notions of directionality and loose form. He's not interested in custom geometry that belongs to one finalized thing, but rather how things can come together to create an assembly of units. So discrete modes of operating are analogous to the Latourian composition project in that they both advocate assemblage and reconfiguration in place of creation, so instead of creation. What's more, the discrete mode has evolved beyond its original purely geometric ambitions to include other architectural elements such as graphics, figures, and tectonics. These images here by Areta Lash are studies for a roof. So the study uses a linear unit, varying lengths and orientations of the unit and composes it in a sort of centrifugal manner from an almost center point, therefore creating an assembly of clusters of units. So parts are formed into other parts, which are then nested into a sequential composition. My project, Poppy Red, is comprised of various studies of objects, models, renderings, and animations. That said, it began with a series of drawings. So, this series is more tightly focused on self-similar clusters of lines and varying planar compositions, at least in the phase shown here. So you can see the sort of variations from one frame to the next. This is part 2 of that study. So the idea here for this group is to be seen as a drawing that contains 3 frames rather than 3 separate drawings. It's almost filmic in that way. So the frames are not distinguished from one another in a significant manner. They're meant to be looked at snippets that capture 3 distinct moments of line clusters floating onto a 2D plane. This is the last selection from the drawing set. So the compositional logics in these examples are permutation games based on color fills, line densities, containers of linear elements, and vector orientations, which may seem random at first. Working loosely with the Latourian argument for non-hierarchical order within a composition, the drawing studies are parceled into localized clusters, but not necessarily groups that create a happy whole. They're rather parts that create a continuous network. The idea is to withhold any sort of conventional evaluated criteria at this particular phase. So kind of like typical good drawing versus bad drawing examples. Okay. So that was the kind of like two-dimensional premise, straightforward enough. But like most architects, I left drawing studies as conceptual tools. In this next phase of the project, I became interested in more complex support conditions. I wanted to explore how my painterly interests could respond to or resist architectural volumes. So I started looking at other architects and artists that work with relatively simple geometries, but cover them in complex images and graphics. I was not only interested in process, but also reading the result of that process. How is Michael Heiser, in this example, able to sustain our attention with these simple one-directional extrusions? What is the relationship between the edges of the underlying geometry and the graphic wrapper? I particularly like this example as the image seems to follow the edge of its support quite faithfully, with the exception of these very small moments when the graphic slips or drips onto the side of the piece. I find that this blurring condition between what is geometry and what is graphic is a contemporary problem of visual culture across disciplinary divides. I think that both hard-edge color fills, as well as atmospheric pictorial effects, like the Katerina Gross example on the left, both belong to a larger, very current interest in graphic form conflations. So even though the Sven-Looking example on the far right, it belongs to the 60s, it's anticipating this field of interest, in my opinion. These are Frank Stella's Polish Village series, also from an earlier era, but it's still useful as a useful example of work that attempts to productively entangle color fills with geometric supports. How can the use of color activate different ways of reading depth and figure? So maybe less serious or formal in tone, these examples show graphic mapping and volumetric operations that reveal different effective properties of objects. Ken Price's example on the left uses a solid color as a Boolean operation to further emphasize a surface or texture condition that is separate from the form itself. Saigai's image on the right tells a similar story of graphics or surfaces that can be delaminated from the volume that they're hosted in. This more recent example by Wade Guyton and Kelly Walker on the left illustrates yet another way that graphics and volumes start to interact in really strange ways. In addition, these examples show evidence of graphic processes and digital image errors that uncomfortably bridge the gap between the virtual screen and the material world. So digging into more digital processes, Nathan Heldon's work on the right spatializes what we currently refer to as texture mapping or UV mapping in the digital environment. So here's how that works. The flat graphic pieces, which are hung on the walls, are are constantly being projected onto the reflective surface objects which are placed on the floor. So the images are being projected in real time onto the objects as one walks around the space. The direction of the projection is animated by the movement of the viewer. So I want to show a few workshop and studio experiments that have been a part of this research. Here I want to briefly touch on the contemporary collapse of digital fabrication, what we used to teach separately as representation and drawing. I think that these two practices are becoming productively conflated in the academy, at least I'd like to think so. So looking at this video, I think it's important to note that also, although these tests do not privilege the digital over the physical artifact in any way, but rather tries to use one to inform the other. These examples here are student work from a 2-act digital fabrication class I co-taught with Jeff Halstead. We carefully integrated the form generation and MATCAP rendering techniques fluidly through the 2 different acts and through different softwares. And here you're looking at a cross-section of student work from that video, exploring the hydro dipping process, which is popularly used in custom automotive culture, athletic gear, outdoor equipment, and other similar things. So this is a collection of formwork, renderings, and hydro-dip physical artifacts. Using vacuum-formed supports and 3D prints, the students in these workshops and seminars explored the idea of printmaking with 3D substrates. In this set, for example, faceted 3D prints would be draped by color field graphics suspended on the surface tension of chemical baths. When the volume crushes through the fluid graphic, material logics would then produce these unpredictable relationships between the form and the graphic. So this line of material experimentation is also informed by the use of digital tools. So again, I'm exploiting the material behavior to push against the precision of software such that the platform does not overdetermine the visual research. This is a rendered image of a 3D massing study that has been placed onto a 2D canvas with some painterly and graphic content superimposed onto it. So the virtual equivalent of the hydro dipping bath. So similarly to the hydro dipping technique, in this image, we can see the 2D superimposed graphic projected directly onto the 3D form. While you have access to very precise mechanics in these workflows, the geometry itself can behave unexpectedly as you try to forge relationships between these 2 different representations, the render and the actual geometry of the 3D object. So the moments of misbehavior for me are moments for further investigation. What reads as a digital process error to me can be refreshing, especially within a contemporary visual culture that is saturated with high luster, high resolution imagery. So precision can be an unproductive constraint in that way. Back to Copy Red, this image is a table showing the parameters of a hyper-focus series that initiated the 3D version or development of Copy Red. The left column lists different processes, techniques, and methods that I use to dress a fixed volume with variations of graphic film. So this particular set permutates various combinations of these techniques 15 times. You can see varying degrees of precision, control, material agency, and chance operations at play. You may also note how fidelity to the vacuum form positive skews our ability to read the graphic as a wrap, a decal, or color scheme embedded within the volume itself. So these artifacts primarily borrow drawing and printing procedures from graphic or industrial design. On the more precise end of the spectrum, there's also some very slight traces of slick, high-finish commercial processes like the hydro-dipping films, vinyl car wraps, and flatbed sign printing. In this diagram, you can start to see the logics of line, graphic, and material finalization as an attempt to operate beyond one-stop monoformed models like the vacuum forms. So the design ambition in this iteration can be characterized as graphic content, which seems to fall onto grounded volumetric clusters. So this is less a study and more of a proto-architectural proposition. The fall of the 2D film, similar to some other operations I talked about earlier, produces unexpected moments in this graphic form choreography. In this close-up view, you can see the direction change in the line clusters slightly misses the edges of the geometry it's hosted on. Zooming out, it becomes clear that the graphic fall sometimes causes alignments with the formal transformations of the volumes in a coherent way, but at other moments challenges the sculptural qualities of those forms in favor of graphic figures. So this competition becomes a visual narrative for my work. So things to take note of here, in the perspectives that I'm going to show over the next few slides, are the relationship between the graphic artifacts and fragmented, geologically inflected, volumetric organizations. Broadly speaking, the project is an attempt to discover new relations between contemporary visual trends and disciplines peripheral to architecture, so graphic design, animation, printmaking, but also the built environment, something beyond the tabletop object. Though abstract and experimental, the study is still in its initial phases, so the series is meant to investigate visual principles that could be extrapolated into full-scale architectural proposals. You can think of these as rigorous investigations into the sculptural spatial properties of line drawings. Here I hope that hints of Agnes Martin and Franz Sandbach are visible again. While the work relies on advanced digital tools borrowed from architectural computation and the animation or film industry, like the ZBrush 3D painting environment from earlier, for example, it also takes cues from coursework art theory, contemporary architecture, like the references that I've sprinkled throughout this talk. As a final design proposition, Poppy Red's geometric agenda is indebted to concepts put forward by contemporary sculptural works. In particular, I'm interested in Carol Bove's carefully calculated sculptural contortionisms and her investigation of geometric posture. Like Bove's work, Poppy Red employs volumes that have undergone a series of transformations, or in other words, architectural figures in a state of transformation and change. So, to conclude, I'd like to pose today's lecture as an attempt to participate in a digital trajectory that is part of a continuous, fluidly evolving discourse on the relationship between technology and aesthetic theory. This discourse is not pre or post-digital. It's not first wave or second wave. It embraces technology, code-based design, material processes, and our disciplinary representational conventions. I know that sometimes not taking a definitive position can be seen as an evasive stance. However, within the larger context of my research work with the Yessios professorship, I'd like to stage it as a productive bridge between two cultures. A culture that embraces technology as a first principle, and the one that begins its architectural propositions with historical precedents and theoretical positions. Thank you. In terms of like emerging practices and how we start to work through these problems, and also how we start to work like kind of transforming from the sort of like architectural model to something that is out there, that is larger scale than like the tabletop object. So we originally thought of the Art OMI, well, there was an earlier iteration of that at the A+D Museum. We originally thought of that as having some sort of transparency. So the structural frame of that project also was meant to have an expressive, it was meant to have expressive conditions in the work. So with that, the budget did not allow for such things. So we started to reintegrate a kind of like the solid panels with the aluminum frame. But then in the second, or the kind of the next project, the Exhibit Columbus project, we started to work with that idea earlier on, so we kind of started to recalculate or recalibrate the project with those design decisions. So it's not always, I mean, this is like very conventional in architectural practices, but we started to renegotiate the kind of material conditions with the linear expressions. In terms of like the volume or line, I think it's like it sits somewhere in between, and I think that the kind of the transparency and the reflectivity of the surfaces for the Exhibit Columbus model specifically, I think it's such that it can start to sort of like challenge challenge the visibility of the structural frame. So sometimes it should read as lines, and maybe on the interior even more so, and on the outside it should read more like a kind of like a shell of form. Good catch though.
Thank you for energetic presentation. Stimulating work. Very simple question. In the projects that Emily just mentioned, the Columbus, Indiana installation to come, the build work and the sculpture work, especially with your reference to Michael Heiser, can you talk about how in any way, or if you have any interest in either ground, site, or context for either of those projects?
In a very artificial way, I think. And this is something that maybe like we're starting to work with a little bit more with further architectural proposals. So the original piece of the OMI example was staged on a 20-foot by 20-foot square concrete platform. So that was the ground condition that we were working with. And it was very simple. It was kind of like a simple problem to us. And then in the second iteration of the project at ArtOMI, it became slightly more complicated because all of a sudden we were dealing with a kind of like with landscaping components that we did not have in the first iteration of the project. So we started to integrate that with the graphic component, or the sort of the printed graphic onto the form. In the Exhibit Columbus example, I think we're starting to work with that even further. A, because it's a requirement, and B, because we find that as a natural development of the work, or as a natural progression of the work, because we're working with Dan Kiley's landscape plans. So it's a work in progress. And I think this kind of idea of going from a sort of like three-dimensional, 360 digital space to making these objects, which I think is a really important step or an important way of investigating these kinds of works, I think further like challenges the premise that the landscape or the ground takes over or determines the outcome of the work, and sort of like challenges in a productive way. So it's a kind of give and take relationship.
If that's true, that was really lucky that you had those two rocks and the wood looked exactly like what a coincidence. How about that for a good catch? That's actually not my question.
Okay.
Would it be fair to say, and this is my impression, that your work at the moment is still focused on close attention? All the work is geared towards producing close attention in its apparent audience or apparent. That be for it?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay, the reason I say that is, and I notice that because there's nothing but art and philosophy, no architecture. No, you're fine. Just fine, sort of. So I just calling to your attention that Benjamin, not a thinker I think much of, but one oftentimes thought about, set up a moment where distracted attention belonged to architecture. And that had to do with lay persons in relationship to buildings. And close attention belonged to art objects. And then he posited the economic and political distinction between paintings and drawings, and photography, and film, but nevertheless maintained a dedication to close attention. And later on that bifurcated into two possibilities: close attention and close reading. What you show us are works that are about close attention, most of the artwork, or close reading, Mel Bachner and conceptual project. Architecture, on the other hand, has been trying to do, as a discipline in its own right, its own discourse, its own writers, its own practitioners, have been trying to find out the interim spectrum of attentions, neither close reading nor close attention, nor distracted attention. And in some sense, most of the production that's important in discourse, in terms of building design, site design, actual constructions in the world from remediation of the material, has been devoted to occupying that zone and activating it as a political issue. I don't see how your work ever seeks to enjoy a relationship that way. You refer, for example, to architecture as a question of graphics, tectonics, and not as a question of disciplinary history or disciplinary problems. This is fun. You're at the beginning of your this is not a criticism. But I wonder, are you so aware of that you make it a blatant thing, never to show any work of architecture, never to mention any writing about architecture, not to compare your work in any way whatsoever to an active 100-year-old discipline working between distracted and close attention, whereas that's where you decide to stand entirely in close attention, close reading. Not that that's a criticism.
I don't know that it was intentional. I think
This is how you feel. I'm not worried. I mean, is that how you feel about your work? Like, close attention is a place for you to be as you think about architecture. And architecture's disciplinary history is probably less important today for reasons. It seems like that was an overwhelming consequence of your lecture. And I just wonder how you thought about it in relationship to your discipline.
Well, so I don't know that I've placed those parallels or that I've seen those parallels.
You're not going to see them in writing. I just
So I'm not sure. I can't come up with it on the spot. I have to think about it. I think I do have like a sort of slight fear of articulating these ideas with architectural examples as a way of kind of like pitfalling into known conventions. So I think this focus on smaller scale to a little bit larger to a little bit larger is a way that I'm trying to investigate that kind of scale of attention through a kind of rigorous investigation through art and philosophical references rather than known architectural projects. But I think like some of the things that I was talking about earlier in terms of like digital tools and how they entered the architectural field, I think the reason why I didn't have any references, I think that's because like, I don't know, we know those references.
I'm asking that reference. You mentioned it, Miranda. It's not that you didn't mention it. It's not that I'm interested in references.
No. But
it's the problem set that makes it. It would be easy today to say, because of media, because of the nature of attention, because of the demands on attention, qualities of attention, and distracted attention, and even the interim between distracted and close attention, are just so, the competition for that with media, with iPhones, with every other possibility, makes that a declining area of research. And becomes a kind of, exactly what Benjamin was saying, is a kind of aficionado's practice and not a practice for political practice. That would be, I think, a reasonable position to take about the work about staying very close to the two polar ends. So I'm actually interested in this, like how...
well, there's like, okay, so that's where the serial mode of working, I think, becomes interesting because it's such that you have different units, different elements, and you're looking at the work through the relationship between the units and the elements. So that kind of like ties into like a sort of like fast-paced, close attention, and sort of looking at things like quickly, looking at 9 things in an image because not one image is more important than the other. It's about looking at the overall thing, right? So I think maybe like I haven't really thought about when the time comes to remove one of those as an exploration set and develop that further and where I place attention in that scale. Like I haven't really, thought of that yet, but I think, I think those are interests in seriality, particularly, and relating back to like. Thank you. Gala.
That was great. I love the work. I specifically love the revealing of the process. So the screenshots of all the software. Because I think one of the trends maybe that your work responds to is Sometimes that word situates itself as like pixel only, right? So it's, I'm only going to deal with images, and I'm only going to map images on the form and then see what happens when you do that. But you started off talking about lines, which means that you're really interested in vectors as well. And so you're fluent in both the vector and raster, and you're kind of negotiating between all of those as you move from software to software in a way that it doesn't let the software constrain you like it does maybe a couple of people that get into it. And so I wonder, do you ever feel that the software, it might constrain you to a certain degree, or would that just, I guess how tied is the method of like projecting, mapping, generating lines and all that to specific software?
So that's something that's like really, really important to me as I develop these kinds of workflows. I think the thing that I would like to highlight, and maybe even more so to the students, is this sort of the information workflow, or the sort of information loop from testing things in like physical artifacts via digital processes, understanding the kind of like the structural framework of digital processes and how you construct something in the digital world and how you translate that back into like the physical artifact. So I think with that, that's like the kind of like the method that I like to use in order to avoid becoming too embedded or too enmeshed in one process or one software, or some like a software that offers only one particular thing. So I think like it's actually like really important. I tried to show that tonight, but to show a sort of variation or taken advantage more or less through like many different platforms, not necessarily just focusing on one. So I think like the kind of like the translation between vector information to raster information, I think that also helps like to not become constrained or remain within one particular software, which I think is important. But I actually think that's like a really important way to think through these problems, as well as like, you know, we are no longer operating outside of the digital anyway, so. Okay, should we call it? Awesome, well thank you so much.